David Knight Show.
Welcome back. It's a tragedy that's been unfolding for quite some time now in California. It's not the first time we've seen this, actually, either. It's raised a lot of questions from a lot of people. President Trump got into a fight with Brown, as well as Maxine Waters, as well as with another representative calling him out on the fact that he was talking about mismanagement. But there's a lot of different issues here. You know, when I look at this situation, like I said, if we think about it as kind of a human body, you know, we got a situation where we're constantly being exposed to toxins in our environment or bacteria or viruses. If we have a healthy immune system, we can fight that and we can control that before it gets out of control. And so there's a lot of different questions about these fires in California. Number one, how did they start? You know, it's kind of like who exposed you to something? It's important to know that, because if we have an outbreak of disease, we need to know who patient zero is. We also need to know if it's something that's malicious. And so there's been some speculation by some people that this might be malicious. It could be arson. It could be incompetence by the power company with the electric grid. It could be deliberate with directed energy weapons to try to force people off the land with Agenda 21 and so forth. That's something that came up the last time we had these fires about, I guess it was about a year ago or so, last October. We had about 170 fires that started. They blamed it on things that happened at 3 electrical stations in the grid. We'll talk about that coming up here with Richard Sachs of Lost Arts Radio. He contacted me, wanted to talk about some of these issues. There's also other issues as well. How come the immune system there is so weak in terms of, being so dry? Think about it that way. Why are the forests so dry that when it gets exposed to a stimulus like that, a fire, that it can't control that naturally? Is it man-made global warming, as the Democrats are saying? Is it geoengineering, as many of us suspect, that is making the forest dry? Or is it just a natural cycle? And then it comes to treatment issues. You know, we've had situations where Obama took away the medical treatment for forest fires a few years ago. I'll tell you how that works. President Trump is talking about things that have been done from a bureaucratic standpoint that actually exacerbate the fire once it gets started. So you got all these different things. How did it start? What's the matter? Why is everything so dry? And then what is it that the bureaucracy is doing to exacerbate this? So I want to touch on all these different issues with Richard Sachs. Again, he is an independent holistic health scientist. He began in 1965 trying to figure out health issues that were challenging in him. And as part of that, he is now helping other people. You can find out information about Richard and about his program at lostartsradio.com. Thank you for joining us, Richard.
Hey, David, thanks for having me on. It's a great show today. I've been able to watch most of it.
Well, thank you.
Whitaker sounds fantastic, but
let's talk before we start talking about how the fires start. Why don't we start with the immune system? Because I know you wanted to talk about geoengineering. We've got the Democrats saying, well, it's man-made global warming. They blame everything on man-made global warming. But we know that there's geoengineering. I mean, the Chinese are actually out there bragging about it. You know, they'll sign treaties with the U.S. and then they'll try to tamp it down and say, no, it doesn't really exist. Chinese are bragging about it. We know it exists. I mean, is it something that's natural? Is it man-made global warming? Or is it geoengineering that's being done deliberately?
Well, first of all, just 1 second of full disclosure here. I'm not a fire specialist or anything like that, but
Sure.
During the more than 50 years of health research, the last 20 or so, I got into a study of what the global rulers are doing, and connecting a lot of dots at InfoWars was really helpful. I did a lot of my own research. And so I look at these things like the fires from a little bit different point of view. And the reason I contacted you and asked for a chance to make a couple of comments is that President Trump, who I really support because of his attitude and his motive, and not because he's absolutely right on everything like shooting missiles into Syria and stuff, but because his attitude makes him a global treasure. And that's why everybody's, the system is attacking him. But anyway, I heard him say, and Travis was talking about this on your show, that it was because of bad management of the forest, which I'm sure is partly true, because if you let the tinder build up really deep and never do anything about it, it makes a good material to burn. But there's a bigger reason for these fires. And I'm talking fast because I have a lot to tell you, and I want to pack it into a few minutes here. But first of all, in the forest management, that should have the caveat: absolutely no toxic chemicals like Roundup and other sprays put in the forest at all. What they
Yeah.
should do if they really want to manage it, excuse me, is to grind up the tinder and make it into a mulch and leave it there. And that way it would fertilize the soil, save water, save a lot of money for the Forest Service. It would be a tremendous improvement over what they're doing now. But Governor Jerry Brown, who has done so much damage in California, is just indescribable, especially to children with the forced vaccination stuff and sanctuary state nonsense, which the fact that anybody goes along with that is incredible. But Brown said, no, it's not mismanagement, it's climate change, which on his part was just a chance to blame every problem in the world on climate change so that you'll give up your rights, stop using energy, and beg for tyranny, which I understand that. But in a funny way, and I made a video on this yesterday, I think Governor Brown is right. And there is man-made climate change. I want to be really clear that I believe that 100%, and that it's a danger to every life form on the planet. And the name of it is geoengineering.
Yeah, I agree.
And that has been, I've had the privilege of working with Dane Wigington and Russ Tanner for a while on Geoengineering Watch Radio, which is no longer on the air as far as I know. But that was about 5 years ago, and we got to watch the storms coming in off the Pacific on radar. And just about when they would hit the coast, these swarms of planes would come in, and you could see the trails of what they were spraying, solid particulates. Those white lines are not ice crystals like the Weather Service and everybody tries to say. And as they sprayed in front of the storm, it dissipated and came together again. Yeah, your picture's great. Thank you. It came together again.
We've all seen movies of this. As a matter of fact, I think you were at the conference that Steve Quayle had, and Steve Quayle had a clip from Geoengineering Watch and movies of them, deliberately spraying this massive amount of spraying that was going on. There's another example of
exactly. Which travel route are those guys on, right? And
I think those pilots are drunk or something. The other thing that's interesting too. Yeah, there's something else that's interesting about that as well. We had there was an app, actually a small documentary called Skyder Alert, and they tied it with that, and they put out an app on your phone. If you saw chemtrails like this, a massive cross hatching of contrails like that, you take a picture of it. And what they did was they did crowdsource research. They found that in areas where that occurred, that the temperature went up. So they're actually creating localized areas of global warming. So they are engineering that. They have conferences, geoengineering conferences, and what they put out on papers is that who gets to set the thermostat? We're going to have a dispute between different countries as to who sets the thermostat.
Exactly. And remember that as far as understanding it with the bigger picture in mind, their interest is to create as destabilized weather systems as they possibly can. Because if people are totally panicked about climate change and they can see it becoming totally abnormal, which it is, with these polar vortices and things that didn't exist before, then they can say, well, yeah, we didn't want to tell you, but climate change is really bad. It's worse than we said. But we have the answer, and here's the tyranny that's going to protect you from it. So I think these guys are just working right into all the other programs.
They need a global problem so they can present you with a global government. They can have a global tax to fund that global government. It's a problem solution that is there. And there's a common thread amongst all of this stuff. We look at this and say, well, is it incompetence or is it maliciousness? When we come back, we're going to talk about some of the incompetence and maliciousness. Stay with us. We're going to look at some other aspects of this with Richard Sachs, at Lost Arts Radio. Welcome back. We're talking to Richard Sachs of LostArtsRadio.com. As Richard pointed out, he's not an expert on fires, but I've talked to experts on forestry. And quite frankly, they agree with President Trump. And we got three different issues here, and we just talked about one of those. First of all, how did the fires start? And we're going to talk about that in this segment with Richard. We talked in the last segment about, this is you're presented with an issue. Maybe it's lightning, maybe it's arson from somebody, maybe it's electric utilities, or maybe it is directed energy weapons, or something of that sort. Maybe that's what is the impulse. But if it's a healthy forest, it can handle that. Now, if the forest is dried out because of a climate, that could be something that's natural. It could be something that is man-made global warming, or it could be geoengineering. We know geoengineering is going on. We know that is, we've measured that. We've seen that it creates warming. We know it drops hazardous chemicals, not just on the forest, but on us. And so we know that they are changing the climate directly. I mean, we look at these different issues. Is it something that's natural? Is it something that is based on incompetence? We don't really understand what's going on. That's a lot of people say, well, that's man-made global warming. People just haven't woken up to the problem, and they don't really realize what's happening with us. But no, I think it's actually more directed, and it's more malicious. It's geoengineering. So I agree with Richard. That's why I wanted to get him on. And then there's the other issue. Once you have let's say a weak ecosystem because it's dry, and you have an impulse, a fire, and it starts to, then what happens at that point? How do you put it out? I think President Trump was right to talk about the treatment aspect of it. He maybe should have waited as people were dealing with the grief of what they had lost, family members that were lost, property that was lost. Nevertheless, he was absolutely right. I had an uncle who was a forestry professor, and he told me this decades ago. He said they've made the conscious decision not to put this stuff out. We have a guy, and let me just take a second here, Richard, and tell them what Merrill Matthews of the Institute for Policy Innovation said. He said, for decades, U.S. Forest Service allowed logging companies to enter forests and clear out dead, stressed, diseased trees and underbrush, all of which are kindling for wildfires. He pointed out that between 1960 and 1990, about 10 billion to 12 billion board feet of timber were removed annually from national forests, but there's been a steady decline since. That's left forests filled with dead, diseased trees. Even the U.S. Forest Service warned as recently as last December that in California, trees that had died because of drought and bark beetles totaled 129 million, or 8.9 million acres. And so you have this fuel that is thrown on the fire. President Trump is exactly right about that. That is, you could chalk that up to incompetence of a bureaucracy, or you could chalk that up to maliciousness. I think it is malicious. I think there is a conscious decision based on Agenda 21. Also, what do you think, Richard? I think they want these fires to get out of control. When it happened in North Carolina in the Gatlinburg area, where my family used to go all the time, very unusual fire that they had a year or two ago. I think it's been 2 years now. You had the government official come out and say, well, you shouldn't have any houses that are close to natural areas because we're just going to let these things burn. You pointed out that they ought to go in and chip that stuff up so that it's not dangerous. But I mean, we could go in and build houses out of some of the standing wood, but they've taken a different approach.
Right. You really don't have to take it out of the forest at all. If you turn it into a mulch, it's not a fire hazard. The whole thing is solved that way. And you just make a rule, no more hazardous chemicals masquerading as forest management at all. That's the end of that. And the other thing is that, we have military forces, including an air force, to protect us from attacks nationally. This is an ongoing chemical air raid. It not only controls the weather and messes it up, can make it warmer or colder. They can do chemical ice nucleation and make hailstorms at 70 degrees. I've seen that. But they also dump explosive metal dust all over the forest. They've been doing that now for decades. So whatever causes a fire at that point, it's not going to burn normally anymore. This is a chemical air raid going on over the U.S. and most of the world now every day. To let that go and I'm not saying any violence or anything, but just use the Air Force to very nicely make those planes land, arrest the pilots, find out who their bosses are. The whole problem would be over in one day.
And we've had whistleblowers talk about it. We've had a lady, I remember a lady, I can't remember her name. She was a whistleblower saying, I was on a plane that was, dumping that stuff. And we've had people say, look at all the barium and aluminum that we're now suddenly finding in the water. So there are measurable traces of these chemicals that are being dropped out. We can see the effect of a lot of these things. There's a lot of different aspects of this. Talk a little bit about, you have any opinion about how these fires started? We're seeing a lot of information coming out in the last 24 hours. Again, blaming it on electric utility companies. We saw this back in October 2017. There were 170 fires that started spontaneously in a lot of different places all at once, and yet they said, well, it was 3 fires that were started, we
Total
think, from the,
coincidence. Yeah.
yeah, coincidental, yeah.
Right. Right. It's interesting because it's not a single issue. That when the forests burn in an explosive, unnaturally hot manner, I think that's because it's saturated with metal dust, and that's on purpose. But
Hmm.
there's another thing going on connected with Agenda 21, and there are houses. This happened in Santa Rosa. It just happened in Paradise. It's happening in Southern California. They can now target a house, have it burn way hotter than it could possibly burn in a natural fire, melting metal and glass, and then the plants that are 5, 10 feet away are untouched. Plastic water jugs don't melt when they're right next to the fire. This suggests some kind of intentional, possibly directed energy weapon starting, but I don't have personal proof of that. I know some
Yeah.
of the people that have been posting videos about it. There are questions about whether those were realistic or not, or actually faked. I don't know. It could be discredited by putting up some fake ones, but it's really clear that they're clearing out whole subdivisions and leaving the plants in between the houses untouched, and then changing the zoning in cases like Santa Rosa so that people can't move back in. I don't think that's all coincidence.
Yeah, and we know that directed energy weapons is not a fantasy or a conspiracy theory. I mean, there's History Channel documentaries about directed energy weapons. Matter of
Exactly.
fact, you're going back to the Panama invasion, Panama Canal invasion, that under George H.W. Bush. There was a documentary done at the time, Panama Deception, and they had eyewitness testimony of people saying, "Yeah, we saw these cars
Right.
incinerated with people inside of them." They also
If you
have, yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. I just wanted to mention that if you had a president like the one that we have now, who would actually use the military for this legitimate purpose to get this stopped overnight, calling it a conspiracy theory would be over, because you
Yeah.
would have the pilots in custody, and you would very quickly find out the power structure behind it. Of course, this might upset the global rulers a little bit, but it would definitely expose that the media is out there just trying to keep everybody totally unaware of what's actually going on.
Well, I mean, there are conspiracies out there, and there aren't. It doesn't have to
Yeah,
be a theory. I mean, that is one of the most frequently applied charges by the Justice Department. They charge anybody committing a crime if there's more than 2 people involved and they're working together. They charge them with conspiracy in addition to whatever the crime is.
right. It's a
And
real crime. It's not
yeah, yeah. I
imaginary.
mean, we understand that there is an agenda out there. I mean, the UN is public with the agenda, the different ways that they want to reorder our society, and so forth. We know that they've moved very hard to impose these types of things. And as I look at what happens in the areas where these fires spill out, especially in the forests that are purportedly managed by the government. It destroys the communities, and I was going to play a clip before you came on, but I ran out of time. Tad Haupt was a logger up in Oregon. This is a guy who had worked all of his life as a lumberjack. He'd saved up his money. He had a plot of land, and it spilled out of the federal land and destroyed everything that he had. And he was ready
Yeah,
to retire, and he didn't have any insurance that could cover that type of loss.
yeah.
And so basically, he's off the land.
If they keep blocking the water long enough, nobody's going to be able to live in California
Yeah,
until
yeah,
until they bring back the people they want to give it to.
that's right.
I,
That's right.
I think
Exactly.
it's time that people connect all the dots, and not just connect it to understand it, but start acting on the solutions, because time is really precious right now.
Yeah, there's a lot of motivations to get people off of not only the rural areas. I mean, that was what was going on with the Bundys. They were trying to confiscate people's
Exactly.
property. I've talked to loggers as well as miners and ranchers and so forth, but the loggers are seeing this in terms of the forest fire. They understand how they, with their policies, have essentially poured gasoline on the fires, regardless of how they have started. They've poured gasoline on them. You actually had Obama, as he was militarizing all these different police departments, he was withholding firefighting equipment that had typically been surplus military equipment to the rural front lines for people working on it. But you're absolutely right. We know that they're dumping chemicals into the forest. They're dumping them into the cities as well. They're controlling the weather. That needs to be understood. It needs to be called out, and President Trump needs to be aware of that. Thank you so much for joining us, Richard Sachs. And again, you can find out more about Richard at lostartsradio.com. That's our program for today. Thank you for joining us. we need to go back and revisit the foundations of our freedom. Our freedoms don't consist of the things that are enumerated on a piece of paper. It consists of the things that we're willing to fight for. The First Amendment, the Bill of Rights, the rest of the Bill of Rights are prohibitions. They're prohibitions against powerful organizations and individuals taking those God-given rights from us as individuals. You better understand that, because they're taking them right now. We have seen what they want to do. They called it UN Agenda 21. Now they call it the UN 2030 Agenda. They want everybody off of the rural lands. They want people out of the suburbs. They want to pack everybody into the cities, because that's where it is easiest for them to control everyone.
Never missed your show any day.
Thank you.
I mean, never.